The winter wind cut through the ruined village as the women were forced forward by armed men. Their shoes scraped over broken stone and splintered wood. Their lungs burned from cold and fear. Their hands trembled, but they kept walking because there was no other choice. Each step echoed in their ears as if the earth itself groaned under their burden. The soldiers behind them barked commands, but their voices seemed far off like distant thunder. They were shadows in olive-drab uniforms moving, in formation around the broken buildings. They passed over a collapsed wall, and between crumbling chimneys, the sky was heavy with gray clouds that threatened more snow. The air smelled of smoke and decay, as though the village had been scorched by. Wore their hair plastered to their faces, their uniforms torn or discarded. They knew who they were in the silence between shrieks of shells, and now they knew what fate accompanied that knowledge. They were comfort women, once bound to serve. German officers now stripped of dignity, and now captives in a war that defined them as spoils. Their hearts pounded with shame and dread, yet they held to one another silently for strength and solace. They entered the remains of a barracks pressed into darkness as they were driven down the hall, past doors hanging from hinges and broken bunks. Their eyes flicked to the walls that bore charred marks and shattered windows, letting in shards of cold light. At the end of the corridor they halted, pressed into a cellar opening narrow and wet. The guards prodded them forward, their legs weak, but they moved, their vision blurred. The cellar walls cold stone, damp as a tomb. They smelled mold and stale air, their breath ragged as they descended into deeper blackness. The darkness swallowed them almost whole. They stumbled over debris, their hands seeking firm surfaces. The soldiers behind them did not relish this moment. They had orders to bring them here alive intact, but they also carried their own uncertainties. The girls huddled close, their bodies chilled and bruised. They whispered names of mothers, of sisters, of home, but the whispers died before sound fully formed. They clutched the fabric of tattered dresses or undergarments, pressed to their chests, wanting comfort in cloth, though its touch mocked them with memory. Then a light flickered overhead, a bare bulb swinging on a wire. The sudden glow made them blink. The guards pushed them further into the chamber. It was narrow, long enough for 15 people, but only a handful now. The floor was cold stone, the ceiling low, their heads bent. The corners of the room held shadows deeper than pitch, the crackle of a radio somewhere above, overhead. Or was it wind? It sounded like static and voices half heard. They froze, hearing a boot against wood, a gun resting on a crate. Every breath felt too loud in the hush of that subterranean room. One of the women, named Marta, pressed her back against the wall, the dampness seeping through her dress. She felt the walls sweat, their bodies clammy with cold and fear. She glanced at the others, at Lena, at Greta, at Anna. Each face drawn hollow with grief and shame. None of them spoke, their throats too tight, their minds reeling. She thought of home, of laughter, of simpler days of youth before war, before this ordeal. She thought of her family who believed she was serving for Germany, not realizing she was being stolen by the darkest corners of military logic. Outside the cellar door, the guards murmured, a footstep in the hall. They held their breath, the sound of hinges creaking. The door swung inward. They flinched. There was a man in olive drab holding a lantern. He paused in the threshold, his face in shadow. The flicker of the light caused their eyes to dart. He did not shout. He did not point. His presence froze them. He stood silent for a moment longer, then nodded to the guard beside him. That guard made a gesture, and the other men stepped back. The flickering lantern light revealed more soldiers in the hallway. The women pressed themselves against the rear wall, hearts pounding. The lead soldier held up a hand as though to stop them from speaking. He stepped forward slowly, his boots making soft thuds against the wooden door frame. He raised the lantern higher so that the light touched their faces. One by one he scanned them, his expression neutral, no revulsion, no triumph, just an air of duty. The lantern trembled slightly, casting lines of light across their features. He looked at Marta, whose eyes were wide. He looked at Marta's dress torn. He looked at Lena, whose lips were cracked. He looked at Greta, whose hands were bruised. He looked at Anna, whose knees shook, and then he turned away. He walked to the corner of the room, his boots echoing in the confined space. He seemed to study the walls. The soldiers behind him moved, too, whispering among themselves. The women dared not shift. They dared not breathe too heavily. The soldier holding the lantern returned. He flickered the light across the floor, the cracks between stones, the uneven surface, the fragments of splintered wood, the patches of cold water. He shifted his gaze back to the women, his eyes dwelling a moment on each. Then he nodded to his subordinate. The guard at the doorway stepped forward and snapped his heels. He barked an order. The women stiffened. The guard gestured, and several soldiers entered the chamber carrying blankets, stretchers, and a lantern swing arms. They spread the blankets on the floor with slow care as though handling fragile glassware. They motioned for the women to lie down. Marta's body protested, but she forced herself to sink to her knees. She felt the chill of stone bite her knees and ankles. The other women followed, sheathing themselves against the cold as best they could, their backs pressed to the damp wall. The soldiers moved around quietly, placing blankets beneath them, helping them gently into the cloth. They did not touch roughly. They did not lash or shove. They simply guided, their voices in soft German or hushed English or mixed tongue soft as wind. Through the lantern light, they looked at one another, trembling, unsure of what came next. They waited. The lead soldier stood at the entrance of the room, his silhouette rigid. He held the lantern high so that the light illuminated the guards but not their faces. He stayed there motionless. The air held its breath. The women lay huddled on blankets layered over stone. They wrapped the cloth around thighs, over shoulders against ribs. Wishful shields. They looked at each other in the wavering light, hoping for answers. The curdle of silence weighed heavy in their ears. The walls seemed to close in. Their hearts hammered. They expected screams, reproach, humiliation. But none came. Instead, footsteps faded in the corridor. The door clicked shut softly. More time passed. They counted breaths, wondered if the American soldiers had retreated, or were they listening beyond the walls? Was this a foreshadowing of cruelty, or a prelude to kindness? The seconds stretched into minutes. Their minds reeled as they lay in the flickering glow, waiting for what terrible resolution would come next. The sun barely rose on the second morning, only a pale gray glow slipping. Through cracks in boarded windows and shattered panes, the air in the farmhouse was warmer than the cellar, but only slightly, and the women still shivered beneath their coarse blankets. They had not spoken much since being moved there too uncertain, too raw to share more than glances and quiet names whispered in the cold corners of the room. They had expected interrogation or shame or worse. But the Americans kept their distance, giving them space to breathe, but not quite enough to understand. Outside, boots crunched across gravel and snow doors opened and shut. Men shouted commands in English that the women could barely follow, and from the far room came the hiss of water boiling and the faint scent of coffee. None of it made sense to Marta, who stood behind the curtain watching the soldiers move with practiced rhythm. She expected their gazes to crawl over her, expected catcalls or questions or threats, but none came. The men glanced her way and then looked away again as if she were invisible, or as if her presence was acknowledged but not examined. Elsa sat on a cot near the wall, rubbing her arms and staring at the door. It had no lock yet. None of them had tried to leave until the night before, when she stepped into the hallway expecting to be dragged back or struck. But the guard only stood with his rifle and then turned his back to her as if her presence there meant nothing, or perhaps meant something deeper, something complicated, something even he did not fully understand. She had returned minutes later, her heart pounding, telling the others that nothing happened, that no one followed her. No one even raised a voice. They had all thought it was a trick, some cruel waiting game where kindness only served to deepen the fall. But morning had come, and with it no punishment, no change, only the distant sounds of men moving of paper, rustling of cups, clinking, and radio static murmuring from the other rooms. Lena, who had said almost nothing since the seller finally spoke, asking in a flat voice if the Americans were planning to trade them or question them or send them back to their units, back to the officers who had once ordered them to kneel with smiles on their faces. Greta, who had been the first taken weeks ago, and who bore the silence of someone already broken, whispered that maybe the Americans did not know what they were. Maybe they thought the women were just camp followers or civilians displaced by the lines moving back and forth across the continent. Maybe they did not know, or maybe they did and did not care. And that was even harder to understand, because they had lived for months under rules that allowed no privacy, no dignity, no refusal to be seen. Now the refusal to see them was even more jarring. A soft knock at the door made them all freeze, their shoulders tightened. Their hands gripped the blanket edges. Marta stepped forward, her heart loud in her ears, but it was not a soldier who entered. It was a woman wearing a Red Cross badge, with a tired smile and eyes that looked too deeply. She spoke softly in German, saying she was there to help, that she would not ask questions. They did not want to answer, that she had clothes and soap and bandages, and that there was no hurry to talk. Just an invitation to come clean, to eat, to rest. No one moved at first because it seemed unreal to hear kindness spoken in their own language, not from the mouths of men who used German as a weapon, but from a woman who sounded like someone's aunt, or teacher, or sister. And after a moment, Anna, who had barely moved since being pulled from the cellar, stood and walked toward her. The others followed slowly, as if they expected the floor to fall away. The woman led them down a corridor and into a larger room where tables were set with metal dishes and pitchers of warm water. Steam rose from a pot on a stove in the corner, and a man in uniform stood nearby, watching but not watching his gaze. Never met theirs. He stood like a guard, or maybe just a sentry keeping the peace, but his rifle was slung low and he said nothing as they filed in and sat at the table. The Red Cross woman handed out spoons and bread and warm broth, and still no one spoke much. Not even the soldiers. The air was filled with soft noises, the scrape of spoon on bowl, the rustle of clothing, the breath held too long then released. It was not joy. It was not comfort. It was not safety. It was only something else, something new, something unreal, and perhaps that was why none of them could eat more than a few bites. Perhaps. That was why Elsa began to cry silently when the nurse handed her a comb. Perhaps that was why Lena clutched the bread so tightly her knuckles turned white, and why Greta sat stiff and unmoving, staring at the wall as if it might collapse and reveal the truth behind the silence that surrounded them. Later, they were taken back to their room, and still no one came to question them. There were no forms to sign, no demands made, only the distant sound of men moving and the smell of tobacco and leather and oil from weapons being cleaned, as if this place was a waiting room, and the soldiers were just as unsure as the women were, as if war had paused for a breath and neither side knew what came next. The women sat together, pressing knees to knees, shoulders to shoulders, as though the nearness might protect them from the confusion that settled over everything. That night, Marta lay awake listening to the wind outside the farmhouse and the soft creaks of the old boards. She thought about the officer who had taken her from the train station and told her she was beautiful like a porcelain doll. She thought about the times she had been ordered to smile, to sing, to sit on laps, and pretend to laugh at jokes, and how none of it had mattered once the bombs fell and the uniforms changed and the names on the doors were scratched away with bayonets and boots. She heard the soft shuffle of Anna rising to use the latrine, heard the doctor creak and then close again, heard her footsteps fade and return. But no voices, no laughter, no fear. Just the quiet of a place where nothing was demanded, and that was its own kind of unease. She wondered if maybe the Americans were waiting for someone to give orders. Maybe they were not sure what to do with women like them. Maybe they had expected prisoners or spies or victims and instead found something they could not easily categorize, something that defied the usual rituals of war. When the guard outside their door changed shifts, he nodded to the new man and then leaned slightly against the wall. His rifle held loose at his side. He looked into the room only briefly, just a glance, and then looked away again as if giving privacy. Was part of his training, or maybe part of something deeper, something chosen and not instructed? Marta wanted to ask him why, wanted to call out and say, "What do you see when you look at us?" But her throat was dry and her heart too loud, and so she stayed silent, staring into the dark. She wondered if tomorrow would be different, if the questions would finally come, or if they would be moved again, traded, judged, forgotten, or remembered. She wondered what the Americans thought when they read the reports about comfort stations and field brothels and how men laughed about it over meals and cigarettes. She wondered if these men outside her door had seen the same reports and decided to pretend they did not, or if maybe they had seen something else in the cellar when they opened that door and found not traitors or whores but ghosts. By the time morning came with its pale light and its thin coffee and its quiet nods from soldiers, no one had spoken about the future, but there was a shift in the air, the kind that precedes storms or revelations or change. The women began to bathe when invited, began to eat a little more, began to ask for things like shoes or combs or paper. They still whispered among themselves, still flinched at sudden sounds. But their eyes began to lift from the floor, and when the door opened, they no longer expected pain, only questions that might never come. And it was this silence that unsettled them most, because silence in war was always a signal, and they could not yet tell if it meant the end or another beginning, waiting just beyond the next command, beyond the next knock on the door. The night was colder than the last. The farmhouse groaned softly under the weight of the wind, and somewhere far off, a dog barked, or maybe it was a wolf, the sound twisted by distance and memory. The women lay wrapped in their blankets, their eyes open in the dark. Though none of them spoke, Marta watched the shadows shift across the ceiling as clouds passed over. The moon. She could hear Anna breathing nearby, steady and shallow, and could feel the tightness in her own chest, still unsure if this strange safety was real or only another form of waiting. When the moonlight touched the door, Elsa rose again, her bare feet silent against the floor. She moved slowly every step, a question, every breath, a dare. She reached for the handle, expecting again the sound of a voice or the barrel of a rifle. But instead, there was only silence, and beyond it, the soft hum of the farmhouse and the low murmur of radio static. Elsa stepped into the hallway, and the soldier standing there turned his head just enough to see her in the corner of his eye. Then he looked away again, his hands loose at his side, his weapon slung behind his back. Elsa walked past him, her fingers brushing the wall for balance, her body tense and shaking. She moved through the hall, one step then another, her mind racing through every punishment she had ever witnessed, every cruel moment. Dressed in discipline, but none came. She found the kitchen empty, the radio room dim with blue light, the front door barred but unlocked, and beyond it, she saw the trees black against the silver sky. And for a moment, she imagined running, disappearing into the woods and finding no one ever again. But she stayed rooted, her hands pressed against the cold door frame. She turned back down the hall and found herself in front of another room, a door slightly ajar. Inside, she heard soft voices, men talking in English, their tones low, calm, the rhythm of soldiers, not officers, discussing things not meant for ears like hers. She leaned closer, trying to understand caught words like orders and routes, and maybe even Berlin, but it was hard to. Be sure a floorboard creaked under her weight and the voices stopped. She froze, breath caught, heart hammering. But no one came out. No one shouted. The conversation simply resumed after a moment, as if her presence meant nothing. When she returned to the room, the others stirred but did not speak. They watched her lie down again, watched her wrap the blanket tight and close her eyes. But they could not close theirs. They whispered questions that had no answers. Questions like why us and what next? And are we still prisoners? And none of them could say for sure. By the time morning light crept over the hills, they had not slept, only drifted in and out of dreams that felt more real than the world around them. Later that day, the man with the lantern returned, but this time he was not alone. He entered with a folder in his hands and a translator beside him, a woman in a long coat with a sharp gaze and a voice that cut through the quiet. She introduced the man as a colonel and said they would not be harmed, that he was only here to ask if they needed anything, if they wished to write letters or speak to someone from the Red Cross. She said they were not under arrest and that the war had moved on and left them behind. Marta asked in a hoarse voice if they were going to be sent back to Germany. The colonel looked at her for a long time before answering, his expression unreadable, and when he finally spoke, he said they were not being sent anywhere unless they chose to go, that they were considered displaced persons, and that meant they could be relocated or stay in the camp or apply for transport to another zone, and the translator repeated every word as if saying it twice made it true. But the women could only stare because freedom had never been offered as a choice before. He handed the folder to the translator, and she moved through the room offering papers and pencils, asking them to write down their names, birthplaces, and anything else they wanted to share, not for military. Files not for trial, but for history, she said, so their names would not be lost in the fog of war. So someone might remember them, not just as ghosts of a broken army, but as people. Marta held the pencil in her hand, like it might burn her. She stared at the page for a long time before writing a single word, her name in thin, crooked letters. When the colonel left, he nodded to each of them, his eyes soft not with pity, but with something like recognition. And for a moment, Marta felt seen in a way she had not felt in years, not as property, not as a burden, not even as a victim, but simply as someone who had survived something unspeakable and would never be the same again. That night the women gathered, closed, their bodies no longer huddled from cold, but from memory, their voices low, their hands resting on each other's arms and knees as they began to share pieces of themselves. Lena told them about her brother who had gone missing on the Eastern Front, about the last letter he sent her and how she kept it hidden inside her boot. Greta spoke about her fiancé who was forced to serve and never came back. Anna said nothing, only held Elsa's hand and squeezed it once hard, and Elsa nodded, because silence sometimes held more truth than words. Marta listened to them, and then finally she told them about the train station and the officer, and the first night and the last, and how she stopped counting the men after 20, because numbers meant nothing anymore. They did not cry. Not then, not yet. But something had shifted among them. A thread of something fragile and invisible. A kind of trust, born not from hope, but from endurance, from the knowledge that they had seen each other at their lowest and still chose to sit side by side when the sun rose. They looked out the window and saw that snow had fallen during the night, covering the ground like a shroud or a promise. It was beautiful and quiet, and for a moment they allowed themselves to believe that the worst might truly be behind them. But even then they knew peace was not simple. Freedom was not gentle, and survival was never clean. They knew the world outside that door still held danger, still held judgment, and that what awaited them beyond the gate might be worse than what they had already endured. They did not know how the world would receive them, how families would react, or if names they wrote down in pencil would be remembered with kindness or contempt. They only knew that for now, they had a room with a door that opened, and guards who looked away instead of staring through them. And they knew Elsa had walked the hallway without chains, and that meant something, even if they did not yet know what and when night came again, and they lay in the dark. It was different this time because now they waited not for pain, but for answers. The sky was pale and cold. When the colonel returned this time in a dark overcoat with a wide collar dusted with snow, his boots tracking slush across the wooden floor, his presence changed the air in the room even before he spoke, and the women straightened instinctively without being told, without even thinking about it. They watched him as he scanned the space, his eyes touching each face as if counting something beyond number, and behind him came the translator again, the woman with the steady voice and the folder under one arm, her heels soft against the boards. They did not sit. They did not smile. They waited as they had always waited since the trains, since the stations, since the first time a door opened and silence carried more weight than a command. The colonel cleared his throat and spoke not with the force of a soldier, but with the weariness of a man who had read too many reports and seen too many broken things. He said there were transports leaving soon. Red Cross routes heading west toward zones with more food, fewer soldiers, warmer weather, and maybe better chances for what people were calling a new life. He said they could choose to go or to stay or to wait for more information, though none would likely come quickly. He said no one would force them and no one would follow them. And when he said this, the room seemed to pause as if the wind outside had leaned in to listen because no one had said such words to them before, not during the war and certainly not now. Not in uniforms, not in buildings with guards. The translator repeated it all slowly, carefully letting each word settle in the air like dust in sunlight. Then the colonel said something else. Something unexpected. He said they were not expected to explain anything. They had done, or had been made to do. He said their records would not be published, their names would not be listed on posters or broadcasts or official briefings. He said they would be given privacy and that this was not charity. It was a recognition of something unspoken, and here he hesitated for just a moment, his jaw tight before continuing. Because he said some things should not be preserved as evidence because survival was not guilt and suffering was not a stain. He handed the translator a set of envelopes with names written in different scripts. Some German, some American, and the women recognized none of them. The translator said these were letters from Red Cross liaisons, offering placement in shelters, camps, even homes, and that they did not have to reply. Not if they did not want to, not yet, maybe not ever. Marta took one of the envelopes, her hands trembling slightly, and the others followed. Greta opened hers slowly, her eyes scanning lines of careful handwriting, a woman named Mrs. Holtz from Zurich, offering a room and a sewing job. Anna did not open hers. She only held it pressed between her palms like a secret. Elsa stared at the address on hers, unsure whether the town written there even existed, or if it had only ever lived in maps drawn before the bombs, before the uniforms, before everything had turned into something else. The colonel stepped back then and gave one final nod, his coat already speckled with fresh flakes, and turned to leave without another word, and the translator hesitated in the doorway, looking back at the women before saying that they had 3 days to decide. Then she too was gone. The farmhouse was quieter than ever. That night, the wind scratching at the shutters, the fire low and flickering. The women sat with their letters folded neatly beside them and their thoughts, unfolding in ways none of them could speak. Marta sat near the stove, her knees drawn to her chest, and remembered the day she arrived at the first camp. Not this one, but the one where it all began. The long line, the barking orders, the smell of burning, fuel, and the sound of laughter echoing from rooms where girls were taught to smile, even when they bled. Greta spoke suddenly, asking if any of them remembered the French girl, the one who sang lullabies in the evenings, until one day she was gone. And no one asked why, and they all nodded slowly, remembering the voice more than the face, remembering how silence had taken her without ceremony, without even a name. And Anna finally opened her letter and read it aloud, a man offering to sponsor her for a work visa in Canada. A stranger who said he had sisters and daughters and could not imagine what she had endured, but believed she deserved a place to heal. Elsa leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes and said nothing at all, because something inside her was unraveling too fast to catch, too complex to explain. And Lena paced the floor, her arms wrapped around herself, whispering that it was not supposed to be like this, that they were not supposed to have choices, or kindness, or paths that led anywhere, except back into shadow. And then she stopped and laughed bitterly, because who said what was supposed to be, who wrote the rules for women like them, who decided which scars were allowed and which ones were shame? The next morning the snow had stopped, but the world outside was no less cold, and the guards who stood watch did not speak when the women passed them on their way to the well or the latrine, or simply to stand outside and feel the wind against their faces, because the wind did not judge it, only reminded them they were still here, still breathing, still real. Marta stared at the hills beyond the trees and wondered what it would feel like to see a street without barricades, a shop window, with bread and soap, a room, with a door that stayed open. She wondered if she would ever be able to laugh again without checking the room for danger first, or if the smell of tobacco would ever stop making her stomach twist. She wondered if she would ever feel clean, not just on her skin, but behind her ribs in the places no soap could reach. And she wondered if anyone would believe her if she told them the truth. Not the clean version, not the one with dates and names, but the real one, the one with cold tiles and hands that did not ask, and nights that never ended. They sat together again that evening, the five of them in the same room as always, though now something had shifted. Not broken, not healed, just moved like a stone that had been dislodged by rain and rolled a few inches closer to light. They talked in low voices about where they might go, what names they might give at checkpoints, what answers they might offer when someone inevitably asked, "Where were you? What did you do?" during the war, and how none of them really knew how to answer without burning everything down again. Lena said she would go to the coast and find work in a kitchen that did not care about the past. Greta said she would accept the offer from Zurich and learn to sew and maybe one day open a shop. Anna said she would write to the man in Canada and ask him about his daughters, and Elsa said nothing, just looked at the fire as if it were telling her something only she could hear. And Marta said she did not know where she would go, but she would not stay. Not because the place was cruel, but because it was too kind, and that night when they lay down on the same thin mattresses under the same threadbare blankets, they did not sleep with fear. In their lungs they slept with questions in their bones, and hope not as a light, but as a shadow that meant there might be a light somewhere ahead waiting. The sun rose slow and heavy behind the clouds, casting long gray light across the courtyard, where the snow had begun to melt in thin patches, revealing the frozen earth beneath the air was damp with thaw, and somewhere in the trees crows called. To each other in a language older than any war, the women stood in coats that did not quite fit with boots too wide or too tight, holding the last of their belongings in canvas satchels slung over their shoulders. They stood in silence, watching. The trucks line up near the gate, and the Red Cross officers walk between them with clipboards and lists and voices soft with practice. Marta shifted her weight from one foot to the other, feeling the bruise on her heel from boots borrowed from someone who had long since disappeared. She clutched her satchel tighter. Her fingers numb despite the gloves someone had handed her the day before. She had packed nothing of value because value had no meaning anymore. Only weight, only burden she had folded. The letter from the woman in the south, and tucked it between the pages of a notebook she found under a cot, and in that notebook she had written a name. Not her real one, but one she could grow into. Maybe Elsa stood beside her, eyes fixed on the tree, lined lips slightly parted as though she might speak, though no words came. The others were near Greta and Lena, helping Anna, who limped from an old wound, never treated properly. Not when pain had been expected and ignored by design, the guards did not meet their eyes this morning. They stood by the gate, faces blank, rifles still slung across their backs, but their shoulders were not as rigid, and one of them even nodded as the colonel approached, his coat buttoned against the wind, his boots spotless, his face drawn with sleep or something deeper. He said nothing at first, just looked at the 5 women, then at the papers in his hands, then back at them one by one. His eyes did not search or demand, he simply saw. And then he gave a small nod and said the trucks would leave in 10 minutes, that they could board, whichever one matched their letters, that no one would stop them, that the soldiers would not follow, and the paperwork was already complete. And then he turned and walked away, without waiting for replies, because replies were not part of this anymore. Choice was its own response. The gate opened with a slow groan of rusted metal, and the trucks rumbled to life, the engines coughing into motion, and the women moved forward, slowly, unsure if they were walking toward something or simply away from everything that had come before. Marta glanced over her shoulder just once, and saw the farmhouse window, the cracked pane, the curtain that had never quite closed. And for a moment she thought of the cellar and the lantern and the man who had looked at her without speaking, and how that moment had stayed with her longer than any name or number. She climbed into the back of the truck, her fingers gripping the side rail, as she pulled herself up, and the wood beneath her boots felt solid cold. Real Elsa followed, sitting beside her, close enough for their shoulders to touch the others filed in behind. And still no one spoke, because what was there to say that had not already been carved into the space between them? The driver gave a short wave and climbed into the cab, and the truck lurched forward, the wheels crushing ice and slush and stones as it turned down the road and began to leave the camp behind. A long while there was nothing but the sound of the engine and the rattle of metal and the wind slipping through the cracks in the wooden walls. They did not look at each other. They stared out at the road, at the trees, at the sky, and tried to see what might come next. Marta thought about the woman in the letter, the offer of a room and a job and a town she could not picture. She thought about what it might be like to walk into a bakery and smell bread instead of blood and oil and fear. She thought about how long it might take before she could sleep without waking. Gasping, Greta shifted beside her and murmured something too quiet to hear, and Marta did not ask her to repeat it, because even now silence felt safer than most sounds. Anna closed her eyes and leaned against the wall, and Lena watched the road with a sharp gaze as though memorizing each bend and turn and fork so she could find her way back if she ever needed to, though they all knew she never would. Or maybe that was the lie they told themselves, to keep from falling apart on that road that wound through burned towns and past empty fields where shadows of soldiers still lingered in the broken fences. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes' time, no longer held shape. The truck stopped once at a checkpoint where men in American uniforms asked for papers without looking at faces, and then waved them through, and once at a bridge where another truck waited to cross, and the drivers exchanged a few words before moving again. The countryside changed slowly, the trees thinning the snow, giving way to patches of dead grass and stone, and somewhere in the distance smoke curled from chimneys, and Marta felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not fear, but something softer, more dangerous. Hope was not a thing they trusted, not yet. Maybe not ever, but it flickered anyway in the way the air smelled cleaner and the sky opened wider, and the sound of gunfire no longer echoed in the distance. The truck finally stopped at a junction where signs pointed to different towns and cities, and the driver turned back and told them this was the end of the line for them, that another vehicle would come soon to take them further, that they could rest here, that a Red Cross post was just over the hill and there would be food and beds. They climbed down slowly, their muscles stiff, their minds slower. Marta stepped onto the gravel and looked around and saw nothing familiar but nothing threatening either, and, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she let herself breathe without bracing for what might come next. The others gathered around her, forming a loose circle, not touching, not speaking, just there, just real, just alive, and Elsa looked up at the sky and finally smiled a small thing, a crack in the stone, but it held. And when Anna reached for her hand, Elsa did not pull away. The road stretched ahead, still uncertain. Still long, but it was theirs now. Not given, not forced, not stolen, but chosen, and that was something that no man in uniform had ever offered them before Marta reached into her satchel and pulled out the notebook and the pencil and wrote a single line across a blank page. Not a story, not a confession, just a start. Because she did not know how to explain what they had been, or what they were now. But she knew they were not what had been done to them, and maybe that was enough. The others began to walk slowly toward the hill, toward the post that might have food, or warmth, or only another set of questions, but this time they would face them with their own names, their own feet, their own voices. And when they reached the top and looked down at the camp below with its white tents and its rising smoke and the quiet hum of life beginning again, they stopped for a moment and simply stood there, letting the wind pass through them, letting the past fall behind them like the melting snow. And then one by one they walked through the last door.